Hello again, and welcome as we continue our look through America's founding documents. Today, looking specifically at the Constitutional Convention, what it created, and how, to a limited degree, it evolved in the years following the beginning of America living under the Constitution in 1789. We have thus far looked at the Declaration of Independence as the beginning of America's road to self-government, and America explicitly identifying and protecting individual rights and liberties. We've discussed how the Declaration of Independence, which was written and released to the American public and the rest of the world in 1776, did a number of things. For our purposes today, we're going to recognize how the Declaration of Independence laid out a number of broad principles, how the grievances in the Declaration of Independence regarding the lack of a democratic process in 13 colonies, how the actions of the British Crown and the British Parliament in restricting the exercise of individual rights were the foundation from which much of the inspiration of the contents of the Constitution and then the Bill of Rights could be found. Now, between the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, where Britain recognized the sovereignty of the United States, and the meeting of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, which began in May of 1787, the United States, as a newborn country, would undergo 4 years trying to live under the Articles of Confederation, a document that had been created, maybe hastily, in the immediate wake of the writing of the Declaration of Independence, primarily to create a central government that could help 13 declared states make their way through a war of revolution. Once the war was over, however, it was apparent that the articles were too unwieldy, too inflexible. Among other things, the articles only permitted the levying of taxes and the creation of taxes if all 13 states voted to do so. In order to amend the articles, to change it, to add to it, something that was very much necessary following independence, that too required a unanimous vote from the delegation of each of the 13 states, something that could not easily be done. Now, during this period, 1783 to 1787, every state had already established its own constitution, some with a Declaration of Rights. Every state already had an elected governor, a legislature of some sort, and a judiciary. And by 1787, most residents of the states were very comfortable, going back, of course, even longer to colonial times, in recognizing that there was a place in every state that was its capital, there was a building where the legislature met, and there was an individual who state residents recognized as their chief executive, their governor. The challenge to those who were supporting and were proponents of the creation of a stronger, more empowered national government, what we call today the federal government, the challenges would be many. But one of the first simple challenges was in recognizing how resistant state citizens might be, how state legislatures might be, how resistant governors might be in conceivably having to cede or share more powers with an abstraction, with a new higher level of government, a national government, what we call today our federal government. So it's perhaps surprising to note that the first calls for another meeting in Philadelphia in the same building, now known as Constitution Hall, where the Declaration of Independence had been debated and signed, the calls for that meeting would be done somewhat surreptitiously. As delegates gathered in Philadelphia, eventually 55 delegates would take part in the debating of what would be the Constitution. 39 delegates would be in Philadelphia to sign the Constitution once its drafting was completed and the challenge of ratification would begin. These calls for meetings were initially described as attempts to gather to amend and perhaps save the Articles of Confederation, but we know that many of the delegates recognized that this gathering would in fact be met or convened to write something entirely new, what would become the Constitution of the United States of America. The delegates recognized that the work that they did and the product of their meetings would be scrutinized by state officials and eventually by citizens of the states. The delegates recognized that if this document was truly going to create the type of government they hoped it would, one giving to all citizens a republican form of government, each citizen able to exercise the power that all citizens in the United States collectively held, it could only be legitimate if citizens were able to vote in some fashion as to whether or not they wanted to live under this document. In short, it would have to undergo a ratification process. So the groundwork for this gathering was very important, and I think quite significantly, when the meeting first took place, the assembled delegates selected George Washington, the man, of course, who as the commander of the Continental Army had led the colonies to victory, to independence by 1783. Someone who I suspect, if polls could have been taken in 1787, would have been recognized to be the most trusted, the most honest, the most reliable person in the United States at the time. So Washington, not a politician, a soldier, a farmer, a planter, nonetheless accepted to serve the offer to serve as the president, the presiding officer over this constitutional convention. James Madison, a delegate from Virginia, came as someone who had a pretty good idea, at least in his mind, as to what type of government he would hope would be created in this gathering. He came to the meeting, in fact, with a blueprint, much of which found its way into the Constitution that historically came to be known as the Virginia Plan. And we would see Madison perhaps as being one of the main driving forces behind the creation of a document that would look very much like the Constitution of the United States looked at the time, and still largely intact, still looks today. The meetings were held, again, through the summer of 1787. The windows were closed. The door was locked. The delegates, hoping to complete the process of writing a finished Constitution before leaks could somehow send to the various states information as to what was being done by representatives of the various states behind closed doors in Philadelphia. Thankfully, there was no Twitter. Thankfully, there was no Facebook. And again, these gatherings and these meetings took place again in conditions of somewhat high security and secrecy. Now, what did the framers hope to create in this Constitution? What were their goals? First, we recognize that these were individuals who had, for the most part, lived through the earlier period where very good relations between each colony and Great Britain had broken down. And each of these individuals who took part in the writing of the Constitution lived through a period in which the actions of the British king were increasingly described as being tyrannical, the actions of a tyrant, someone using absolute power to the detriment of a large population, unable to resist those actions. So the framers went into this constitutional convention determined to create a document that would make it very difficult in the future for a small group of Americans, elected officials perhaps, to be able to consolidate so much power into so few hands that they might be able to effectuate an American-made tyranny on American citizens through the misuse of this American Constitution. There were several ideas as to how this might be prevented. And the key to all of them would be the word, somewhat ironically, I guess, separation. Separation, separation. The idea, first enunciated notably perhaps by a Frenchman by the name of Montesquieu, who wrote that in order to prevent one government and too few members of that government to using power to effectuate some type of a tyranny, the best solution might be to identify different functions that government might perform and separate them out into separate institutions, things that we today, of course, call the branches of our government, and then empower those institutions to perform the separate, distinct functions that they were created to do. In a bit, we will talk about, of course, the notable creation in our Constitution of three branches of government, as we call them today: a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch, and the further assurance that these branches would not easily collude, consolidate power, conspire with each other by the creation of checks and balances among and between them to make them, for lack of a better word, competitive. The framers clearly believed that if the branches became competitive with one another, that would be much more preferential than the branches becoming conspiratorial, consolidating, and collusive with each other. Now, the second notable separation was the Constitution creating a federal system of governing. The federal system represented by the fact that at the same time the newly created national government, the federal government, with the three branches, would be able to act on matters that were given to the jurisdiction of the federal government, there were going to be, at the same time, individual state legislatures and governors and courts that were going to be acting on a whole nother host of matters, all those matters not given essentially to the national government, were going to be dealt with individually, state by state by state, through the action of their legislatures. So there was going to be another separation, that between the national government, the federal government, that eventually would have a location, Washington, D.C., the federal capital. That would be where Congress would meet. That probably would be where the president would live. That would be where the Supreme Court would conduct its deliberations. But at the same time, in many respects, far, far away, or what are now 50 different state capitals. Lots of work was going to be done by different groups of individuals, different elected officials, again without the geographic proximity and for a very long time the ease of easy, quick communication to again create these two layers of government. In order to build a national government, a federal government, it would be necessary for the delegates of the 13 states to agree on what powers they were going to give collectively to this national government. I've always liked to describe what occurred at the Constitutional Convention, how the federal government was built step by step by step, as beginning with the delegations of each state arriving in Philadelphia in 1787 with a bag that contained, theoretically, every possible right, duty, and power that a government could have. If things went poorly at this convention, if the Articles of Confederation fell apart, it is conceivable that instead of one United States of America, there could have evolved, European style, 13 separate sovereign entities, side by side by side, up the Atlantic seaboard. So every state arrived there, theoretically, with every possible power of governance, that through the many months, 3 months or so, of meetings and deliberations and discussion and debate and compromise would cause each of the states collectively to identify certain powers that they were going to pull out of their bag, 13 of them, and collectively give to this new national government that they were building, and by this delegation of explicit powers, breathing life into. Now, many of the powers that were given to the national government, to the federal government, were logical. They were powers that one government would be able to do more completely, more efficiently, better than 13 separate governments doing. Notable powers, of course, were the power to wage war. That power resides in Congress. Congress declares war, it brings every state, of course, into that conflict. Similarly, Congress has the power to raise an army, to build and maintain a navy. One army, one navy on behalf of all Americans and their states. Early on, Congress, of course, still does have the power to coin money and to attribute value to it. Better to have one common currency than 13 or now 50 separate currencies to facilitate the flow of commerce. Lots of people over time would want to come and live in the United States, and rather than enable states to establish different policies for immigration and naturalization, the Constitution states that only Congress can make laws dealing with these matters. They were logical grants of power to again enable one government to do more efficiently what individual state governments might not be able to do. But it's important to note, and of course today, perhaps more than ever in recent times, that the delegation of powers by the states to the national government was intended to be a limited, defined grant of explicit power, some powers that they would hold concurrently with the states, and some powers that were implied that the federal government would possess in order to perform the constitutional functions given to those offices. The expectation was, and this is very clear, that once these powers had been delegated by the states, anything that remained in that bag would remain within the province of the individual state and the individual state legislature to deal with. And the belief was, while the powers that were given to the national government, the federal government, were limited and defined, the powers that would remain in the hands of the individual states and state citizens would be large and perhaps expansive, growing greater and greater and greater. So we recognize today, as a consequence of this system we call federalism, that there are many areas of jurisdiction in the law that remain in the hands of the individual states. Whole areas of law remain still within the province of state legislatures and the legislative process, state by state by state. These days, more frequently than ever, we hear of federal grand juries indicting individuals for the violation of federal crimes as perhaps some of the most notorious, perhaps some of the most prominent cases that we hear about. But it still is a fact that perhaps 99% still of all criminal law prosecutions take place at the state level for individuals charged with the violation of state criminal statutes. You know, garden variety, if you want to call it garden variety, murder, burglary, robbery, sexual battery, the laundry list of notorious violent and nonviolent crimes are covered individually in the states by state law. Criminal law is still largely within the hands of individual state legislatures. There are no federal laws, and Congress has no jurisdiction regarding marriage, divorce, separation, custody, alimony, child support. These are still individual state determinations that are made again on a state by state by state basis, sometimes very different in describing what in the eyes of the law is a marriage as you pass from one state into another. Laws regarding inheritance, wills, estates, what constitutes a legal will, who receives the contents of the estate of a person who dies without a will, is still within the province of individual state legislative action. These are a few of the examples of how a federal system gives to each state the vast amount of unaddressed issues given to the federal government in the Constitution. It's important to note that when in 1791 states ratified the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment was intended to reinforce the concept that we just discussed. Federal powers are limited and defined. All other powers belong to the states. The 10th Amendment, and I'm paraphrasing here, essentially states that any powers not explicitly given to the federal government, the national government, and any powers not explicitly denied to the individual states belong to the states and to the citizens of those states. A limited reach of the national government, very much on the mind of the framers of the Constitution at that convention in Philadelphia. Now, what kind of government did the Constitution seek to create? We use a number of different words to describe our style of government. We are a democracy, we are a republic, we are a constitutional republic, we are a federal republic. The key to all of this, of course, is the fact that the Constitution guarantees to the citizens of every state a republican form of government. It does so by recognizing that ultimately citizens, the people, hold power in the United States, and they exercise it by electing individuals to use that power on behalf of citizens who have collectively selected them, elected them to hold various elective positions of trust. Majority rules is sometimes the watchword, except that in the United States, the power of our federal government is inherently limited by the fact that the Constitution that created that federal government places certain limitations on the actions of those individuals elected to fill important offices. We see sometimes as we look around the world at other vibrant, transparent democracies that the will of the majority in electing parliamentary governments, in Great Britain, for instance, in various parts of Europe, in Israel, in places like South Korea, these elections take place, governments are selected, and majority rules more universally because these countries do not have documents like our Constitution that place limitations on what the majority might do in order to ensure that no citizen in the United States becomes the victim of the so-called tyranny of the majority. So republicanism in the American sense, we are a constitutional republic in that those who we elect to important positions in our national government could constitute majorities, but their actions are going to have to take place within the four corners, within the confines of how these branches are empowered by the United States Constitution, a very critical component of this process. So, delegations began arriving in Philadelphia, May 1787. It turns out that one state, Rhode Island, was so suspicious of what might be done in this gathering that it chose as a state not to participate in the drafting, in the writing of the United States Constitution. Only the delegates from the other 12 states played a role in writing the Constitution. Rhode Island would subsequently be the 13th and final state to ratify it, to vote to be bound by it. One of the reasons, of course, are the differences that existed in 1787 among and between these 13 states. Today, of course, we know there's a lot of differences between Georgians and those who live in New Hampshire or Massachusetts. In 1787, there were significant differences and significant concerns as these delegations began to gather. Some states were more populous. Some states were less populous. And each state, large or small, wanted to ensure that they had a proper amount of representation in the institutions that were being created in the Constitution. Some states, those in the South, were heavily dependent on agriculture and the export of agricultural products, cotton, tobacco, sugarcane. As we traveled to more northerly areas with shorter growing seasons, the economy of these more northerly states were driven by trade, by timber, by fishing, and were not as labor dependent as the agricultural states in the South. So slavery as an institution hung over the Constitutional Convention, never directly addressed. The word slavery does not appear in the Constitution, but already in the 1780s, demonstrating itself to be a potentially divisive issue when the country decided to take on the propriety of that institution head on. But again, very much a concern at the time. So the Constitution begins, of course, with a preamble, a mission statement, describing how we, the people of the United States in 1787, were breathing life into a document that again was going to establish this additional layer of government for the benefit of all those living in the United States. Now we get to those branches and recognize that James Madison, when he arrived with this Virginia plan, had already outlined what he believed was going to be a branch mainly concerned with legislation, writing pieces of legislation that might become law. A judicial branch, which Madison envisioned being selected by the input of the other two branches and isolated from the day-to-day scrum of politics and ideologies and grievances to be able to more objectively apply the Constitution when matters that courts were asked to do so. And finally, an executive branch, one office that was going to perform a number of duties, one of which would be to take laws, completed pieces of legislation, and execute them, put them into effect, and ensure that they were being properly administered and were being complied with. Now, Madison's Virginia plan, it turned out, only called for the creation of a one-house, a unicameral legislature. That, of course, would change. Madison's original Virginia plan called for the creation, get this, of a three-person presidency, sort of on the line of the old Roman symbol establishment of a triumvirate, three leaders exercising an executive capacity. Imagine that today. Three individuals, collectively the president, with Twitter accounts and Facebooks and so on. It would be a mess. That, of course, didn't make it to the finished product. The fact of the matter is that as this gathering took place, all of the discussions, all of the meetings were in many respects hypothetical. In many respects, they were abstractions, because unlike more recent democracies that have become the preferred mode of governing, as people all around the world in the last 200 years have gained their sovereignty and could look to other democratic models as one that they might seek to imitate, in 1787 there were no contemporary forms of self-government for our founders to replicate, to copy, to absorb into our own. This was truly a creation being made on a tabula rasa, as they say, on a blank slate. So the legislative branch was going to be called, of course, the Congress. And immediately there were disputes as to how members of Congress would be selected, and maybe more importantly, how many members would come from each of the 13 states that would be represented at the very founding of the government of the United States. Larger states believed, I think logically, that because their population was higher than smaller states, they should have more seats, a bigger voice, a higher percentage of those seats than the small states. might have. Now, smaller states, and again, Rhode Island, Delaware, Connecticut, New Jersey at the time was a very sparsely populated state, looked at it differently. They believed that because this was going to be, again, a government created by actions of all the states, population size didn't matter. They viewed themselves as a co-equal, potentially sovereign entity, state by state by state, and therefore believed that every state should be equally represented, as recognizing their status as a potentially sovereign entity. So the debates wore on, the arguments wore on, plans were floated, submitted, until a representative from New Jersey came along with what came to be known as the New Jersey Plan. It did not involve bribery or influence peddling. It instead involved the creation or the suggestion of the creation of a bicameral, a two-house Congress, what of course would exist when the Constitution was ratified and still exists today. The first house, the House of Representatives, would indeed award seats to states based on population, so that more populous states would have more seats than would less populous states. In order to make this concept viable and accurate going forward, the Constitution would mandate that there be a census, a counting of the nation's population, so that every 10 years, when the population of the country was counted and the population of each state was counted, those states that gained significant population since the last census should be given greater numbers of seats in the House, and those states that had lost significant population since the last census should lose seats in the House. So we fast forward to the present time, of course, there are 435 seats in the House of Representatives. That is a fixed number. That is a static number, 435. It's been that way now for more than 90 years. So when the results of the census of 2020 takes place, we are going to see that some states gained enough population to get more seats in the House. Projections suggest that Texas, which has undergone dramatic growth since 2010, should get 3 more seats in the House. Florida, which of course has been on a trajectory since 1960, growth after growth after growth, decade after decade, may end up with 2 additional seats. There are suggestions that Arizona, Georgia, Wyoming, Utah might receive an additional seat in the House. Those states have to come from somewhere. 435 is a number that cannot be altered, so there are expectations that the 60 or so year trend that has seen people leaving the Northeast, heavily leaving the industrial Midwest, is going to continue. And that perhaps Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Indiana would see the loss of seats in the House because they've lost population since the 2010 census. And for the first time ever, there is a healthy possibility that California, the largest state in the country, 53 seats in the House, might lose a seat, reflecting the decline in California's population. Lots of Californians fleeing perhaps a high-tax state to find a little bit of heaven in places like Texas and Florida, which among other things do not have a state income tax. So that composition of the House is always subject to adjustment. The Senate turns out to have been a different story. We're going to jump ahead a little bit. The Constitution in Article 2 creates the office of President of the United States. It is an office that clearly was going to be the most powerful single office that the Constitution created. Today, of course, as the United States has become a world leader in matters of economics, matters of manufacturing, certainly the world's foremost military power, it's fair to say that the President of the United States is the most powerful individual in the world. But way back in 1787, as the Constitution began to empower the President, the framers also began to build into both Congress and, to a lesser extent, the federal courts, checks limiting how a president may exercise his powers. So the Constitution, of course, among other things, gives the president the ability to make treaties, back when a treaty was really a treaty, with other countries or groups of countries around the world. The president has the responsibility of nominating individuals to serve as ambassadors and ministers representing our country abroad. The president must nominate individuals to fill out important positions within the executive branch, not just within the 20 or so cabinet positions in the United States departments, but in almost 100 federal agencies who are led by individuals nominated by the president. Finally, the Constitution requires that whenever there is a vacancy in our federal judiciary, the Supreme Court, the Federal Circuit Courts of Appeals, and the federal district courts, the president shall nominate an individual to fill that vacancy. Now, the interesting part, of course, is that we've used the word nominate, we've used the word suggest, because the Constitution makes all of these actions, the making of treaties and all of these various appointments, subject to the treaty in question being ratified by a 2/3 vote, and every other appointment being subject to a positive ratification vote coming from the United States Senate, the second house of that bicameral legislature. The New Jersey plan suggested that while the House was going to be populated based on the population of the individual states, in the Senate, every state was going to have 2 seats. Population did not matter. And that was the great equalizing component at the convention that caused less populous states to eventually eagerly vote to ratify it. Unlike members of the House, who in theory are up for election every 2 years. Every 2 years, each seat in the House will be on the ballot in states around the country, all 435 of them. The Senate was constructed quite differently. In fact, until 1914, when the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, which had been ratified the year before, took effect, members of the United States Senate were not elected by a vote of the citizens of their states, but rather were selected by state legislatures, the smart people, who were going to be able to select individuals who would represent the interests simultaneously, both senators, of the state as a whole. Average citizens could elect House members to represent those living in a district. That's been the case from the very beginning. That's why the House has always been known as the People's House, but the Senate was constructed in the Constitution quite differently. Number one, of course, senators until 1914 were outside the direct electoral reach of regular state citizens. Legislatures selected them. In addition, unlike House members who serve 2-year terms, or even the president, who's elected, of course, to a 4-year term, terms in the Senate are 6 years in length. On top of that, Article 1 of the Constitution in Section 4, which delineates the powers in the organization of the United States Senate, goes to great lengths to create a process whereby in every election year, every even-numbered year, only 1/3 of the seats in the Senate are on the ballot. The Constitution required the Senate, after the very first Senate had gathered, to divide itself as equally as possible into 3 separate groups. They're now known as Group 1, Group 2, and Group 3 Senate seats. The Constitution says that those seats in Group 1, the members drew lots, numbers out of a paper bag. Those who found themselves in Group 1 had to stand for re-election in 2 years by their state's legislature. Those in Group 2, 4 years after the Constitution took effect. Those in Group 3 would serve the same and the proper 6-year Senate term. So that going forward, senators, of course, serving full 6-year terms, would create this process where every 2 years, only 1/3 of the seats in the Senate would be up for election. Put another way, 2/3 of the Senate that was in office before an election would remain in office afterwards. And until 1914, those 1/3 of the seats that were up for election were, remember, only up to legislatures to determine whether or not a particular senator would be returned. So, not able to be directly voted out of office by a vote of state citizens. Serving 6-year terms, and again, terms that were staggered. The whole Senate could not be voted out of office in any particular election, made the Senate the place that the framers housed so many of these important checks on presidential power. The House does not have a role in confirming federal judges or ratifying treaties or in confirming any other presidential nominee. Only the Senate does. In a more discreet way, the framers intended the Senate to also have a role in checking what might take place in the People's House, the House of Representatives. Article 1 of the Constitution states that before a bill is ready to be sent to the president for him to do what the Constitution says he might do to it, generally either sign it or veto it, that bill must pass in the same exact form in both the House and the Senate. Until very recently, that meant that many bills that came out of the House, the People's House, members who were more closely connected to their constituents, would die sometimes a very quiet, a very lonely, a very anonymous death, because if the Senate did not take up that bill when that 2-year Congress in session expired, every pending bill would be dead and everything had to go back to the beginning when a new Congress convened. So the framers believed, and they did believe this, that the Senate would be able to check whatever impulses, maybe erratic impulses, maybe spontaneous impulses might come out of the House, the Senate. We've heard it all. The world's most deliberative body that grants to each member the privilege of unlimited debate could determine whether or not that bill was appropriate for their consideration. So, Congress, again, subject to this very important compromise, was constructed. The next attention, of course, went to Article 2, the creation of the President of the United States. The framers, recognizing that they were creating clearly the most important and powerful position in America's constitutional framework, put some extra requirements, some extra filters into individuals that might ultimately be elected president. Now, to serve in the House of Representatives, an individual has to be 25 years old and could be an individual who is a naturalized citizen of the United States. Senators have to be at least 30, and in the Senate, naturalized American citizens could serve in that body as well. In 1787, the framers were very cautious to create again certain requirements for any individual who might serve as president. Number one, at a time when life expectancy was probably no greater than 60 years of age, 1787, the Constitution required that the president be a solidly middle-aged, worldly man or woman of at least 35 years old, the requirement that still exists today. Secondly, the Constitution requires that in order to serve as president, the individual must be a natural-born citizen of the United States. No court has ever interpreted, no statute has ever delineated exactly what natural-born citizen means. At the time, it was intended to be more restrictive. No naturalized citizens clearly could serve as president. They can't now. But over time, we generally believe that if an individual was born to at least one parent who was an American citizen, either in the United States or outside of that country, that individual meets the requirement for a natural-born citizen. The Constitution also requires that the individual to become president, to be eligible to hold the office, had to have been a resident of the United States for the 14 years preceding that time that he might take office. Clearly, in the 1780s, we were very concerned that some French-born or British-born or Spanish-born individual might become president, might become naturalized, might win the office, and somehow sell out the United States. We were concerned that individuals who spent a lot of time in Europe, traipsing across the continent, not within the United States, might have somehow had his loyalties to the United States compromised. So at the time, natural-born meant natural-born in the United States, and that 14-year residency requirement meant that that person was under the eyesight somewhere on American soil. Again, not off in some foreign land. So the president was, again, these certain sets of requirements were created for that individual, and then the president was empowered. The president, of course, is the commander-in-chief of American armed forces. Only after Congress has declared war. Today, of course, unlike the 1780s, we have a large, permanent, standing army, and nominally, of course, the president, a civilian, is the commander-in-chief of our armed forces, but only Congress, through a majority vote of each house, has the power to declare war. We've seen, of course, in recent administrations, beginning with Vietnam, continuing in Iraq and Afghanistan, Congress assent to presidents committing our troops to foreign conflict without a traditional, historical, affirmative vote to declare war. The president, of course, the commander-in-chief of our armed forces. The president, again, has these vast appointive powers: courts, cabinet, ambassadors. The president is the chief executive, meaning that once a bill makes its way out of Congress, and assuming a president signs it into law, the president, as the head of the executive branch, the person who theoretically oversees this large collection of departments and agencies that we call the federal bureaucracy, 20 cabinet departments, nearly 100 federal agencies, the president, as the head of the executive branch, oversees these laws being executed, put into effect, and then ensured to be abided by, enforced through some mechanism of either a cabinet department or an agency following through on this enforcement aspect. All of this, again, within, broadly speaking, the executive branch. Finally, in by far the shortest part of the Constitution regarding the establishment of a branch of government, Article 3 speaks to a federal judiciary. Article 3, in fact, only states that all judicial power in the United States shall reside in a Supreme Court and other such inferior courts which Congress may from time to time choose to create. Note that Article 3 does not identify the number of justices that should sit on the United States Supreme Court, and does not create the position of Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Nor, of course, does the Constitution address the circuit courts of appeal or the trial level, the federal district courts. These have been created over time through legislation. The first being the Judiciary Act of 1789, several from time to time following that Congress sent bills to presidents who signed them into law that have set the number of justices on the Supreme Court. At one time there were 6, I don't know why 6, then 7, then 9. During the Civil War, a 10th justice was added in order to balance out or neutralize perhaps the sentiment of justices who had come from states that had seceded from the Union. And then after the war, the number 9 was set on, and that of course is the number until the present time, unless Congress chooses, through a simple majority vote of each house, to raise or reduce the number of justices on the Supreme Court. If a president signs it into law, the Judiciary Act of 2021 say that number could be raised or lowered. Similarly, Congress has created the 2 main lower levels of our federal judiciary. The trial level, the federal district courts, there are about 100 of them spread across the United States and our territories, and the 12 circuit courts of appeals that hear the overwhelming majority of appeals from adverse verdicts in criminal cases, convictions at the federal district court, or adverse rulings in civil matters that might take place in front of the district courts. The federal power, again, the judicial power housed in the federal judiciary. The framers wanted to make the judiciary as non-political as possible. And really through most of our history, that by and large has been the case. So in order to ensure this, unlike what occurs in many different states, recently, for instance, we've seen an important election take place in Wisconsin concerning a seat on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. At the federal level, federal judges are selected via the following manner. Whenever a vacancy occurs, Supreme Court, Circuit Courts of Appeals, Federal District Court, the Constitution requires the President shall nominate someone to fill it. And of course, we are very familiar, certainly with Supreme Court vacancies, of presidents doing so. Now, in order to ensure, just like in all other types of appointments, that perhaps the president does not appoint crooks or cronies or cranks, whomever the president nominates to fill a position in the federal judiciary cannot take his or her seat unless and until the United States Senate votes to ratify that nomination. And since 2013, all that's been needed is a simple majority vote in the Senate to confirm any federal judicial nominee. We've seen in the last 3 years, very notably, Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, nominated by President Trump, confirmed by a vote of the Senate, take their positions on the United States Supreme Court. Less notably, we've seen in the last 3 years President Trump nominate several hundred judges to fill out positions at the Federal District Court and the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals. The Constitution states that these individuals, once confirmed, can take their position and hold it, quote, during times of good behavior. If you're a good little boy or a good little girl, you could hold that seat for life. The Constitution further states that all judges shall be paid a salary which cannot be diminished by actions beginning in the United States Congress. So these two components, lifetime tenure and protection against diminution of salary, reduction of salary, were two factors that the framers believed, number one, would enable judges to make decisions only by applying the facts to the Constitution or to the law. They would have blinders on regarding political noise and partisanship that is perfectly normal in Congress and for presidential elections, the elected branches, but were not intended to play a role in our judiciary. And lifetime tenure takes federal judges outside of this daily political battle. Secondly, the protection against salary reduction was intended to make federal judges less susceptible to bribery, to somehow profiting off of these offices. And we've seen throughout the history of American jurisprudence that there have been lots of crooked, bribe-taken local judges and a fair amount of state judges, but our federal judiciary has, for the most part, been spared of judges, with their hand out in order to make decisions because of these protections. After the first Supreme Court was impaneled in 1789, we would see in 1803 the Supreme Court decide a case called Marbury versus Madison. One of the most important Supreme Court cases ever returned, in an opinion written by the Chief Justice at the time, John Marshall, who served as Chief Justice for more than 30 years, by far the longest tenure of any American Chief Justice, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress cannot make law that is unconstitutional. Congress cannot do things that does not comport with the Constitution. And Justice Marshall further ruled that the Constitution gave the federal judiciary the power to determine matters of constitutionality regarding not just the actions of Congress, but the actions of the president, and these days, of course, the actions of state and local officials as well. So what might have been an ambiguous grant of power to the federal judiciary was made more concrete when in Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court declared that the Constitution gave the federal courts the power to apply the Constitution to determine the constitutionality of the actions of Congress or the president as well. So these are the three branches of our federal government. Again, limited powers, powers expressly given to the national government in the Constitution, some implied powers that the parts of the federal government need to act, but all of the rest of the powers, all of the other growing powers, unspecified powers, in the mind of the framers, were going to remain within the province of the individual states, their legislatures, and their governments. What do you think? Is that still the case today? So look forward to seeing everybody or speaking to everybody again soon, in the short term, of course, via these video presentations. And when we next meet, we are going to consider the Bill of Rights, the capstone, the finishing part of the process that within 15 years' time, from the writing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, a 7-year war, a constitution taking effect in 1789, and then 2 years later, with the ratification of the Bill of Rights, we would see an articulation of some of those inalienable rights, those rights, freedoms, and liberties that all American citizens would possess, and initially, which the Bill of Rights provided that the national government, the federal government, could not intrude upon. The Bill of Rights was initially intended to limit the reach of that newly created national government, that abstraction, that federal government. This Congress looks mighty big. This guy, the president, wow, what powers did he seem to have? This federal Supreme Court, what might it do? We've seen in 230 years all of these offices evolve, but it's important to note that even at the time the Constitution was ratified, these offices were still largely abstractions. They were ink, I guess, on parchment at the time, creating lots of fears, lots of suspicions among America's citizenry, in particular a fear that some of these positions, some of these offices, might somehow be used by a few to once again impose that T word, that tyranny on America's citizenry. So the end of the 15-year process, the ratification of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, would specifically prevent and limit the federal government from intruding into all of those familiar areas we now recognize as hallmarks of Western-style democracy that the United States introduced to the world throughout this 15-year process, and which is still in some way at the foundation of all of those countries that we believe practice Western-style democracy. So look forward to discussing the Bill of Rights with you at a later date. Thank you and have a fine day.